But bolstering banks alone isn't the answer. Countries have got to get tough. Take the Chancellor George Osborne on his steely path of harsh spending cuts, which are too fast and too deep, according to Olivier Blanchard, chief economist at the IMF.
Austerity versus stimulus is the debate at the moment, and there really isn't a consensus as to which is going to work better in the long term. It has to be remembered that governments, for the most part and almost exclusively, rely on borrowed money. They almost always spend more than they collect in taxes, and they have to fund that difference in international bond markets. And what policymakers, central bankers, and everybody else is worried about is that once that gap between expenditure and revenue rises, the cost to fund it rises concurrently, and it becomes too expensive to maintain. So what they want to do is try to get a closer equilibrium between the two so they can manage the borrowing costs and keep that going for as long as possible. They're terrified that the bond market will, in terms of the market, get away from them. In other words, interest rates will start to rise very, very quickly. Funding the deficit all of a sudden becomes almost impossible because you're borrowing money to repay borrowed money. And you actually get into a spiral in which none of that money reaches down into the real economy and just floats around the ether of global financial markets. Avoiding that is absolutely critical for any economy that wants to have long-term sustainability. However, the flip side is that you can cut so much, you cut into the healthy cells of the economy, and you have what's called the destruction of capacity, the permanent destruction of the ability to grow in the future because you have basically allowed it to wither and die in the field.
And what's defined as real growth is key to this argument, especially coming after swingeing cuts in areas like social provision, the welfare bill, for example.
Then there's the question of, well, do you borrow more money that you're trying to pay back with all these austerity measures and taking away from the social measures? Do you still nevertheless borrow some more in order to stimulate having jobs? And the answer to that is yes, you do, when you're careful about what you're calling investment. I think in the UK we know what we mean by long-term investment, that we're talking about infrastructure, that we're not actually talking about things that are more social costs, that give people jobs but don't actually earn money for the country. But if you talk about investment in some European countries, then they think that that means anything that they could count as investing in people, even if there's no returns. You have to be quite careful.
It's a path being followed, sure. To some, it seems unfeasible in the current circumstances. But what does a banking union actually mean, and what are the potential dangers?
A banking union is what you have when you have a proper currency union, as you do in the United States. So you then effectively have a treasury and you're in control of everything. We don't have that in Europe, and the idea to, if you like, finish off making a proper currency zone was to do that. We've taken the first steps in that the European Central Bank now becomes the supervisor for Eurozone banks. It will only directly supervise the biggest ones, but it's still calling the shots, if you like, over all the others, although the local regulators will doing the hands-on inspections and checks. But that's not enough. I mean, we need also a common backstop regime. If you haven't actually got a common treasury, then you need something that, if you like, replicates that. How are you going to deal with cross-border resolutions? And ideally also a common deposit guarantee scheme.
If you want the Eurozone to survive, an integrated financial system and banking system is an important part of that. You need to have money flowing across borders, otherwise you just get into a situation where you have 17 isolated entities, shoved into a one-size-fits-all architecture, and we get back to similar problems we had before. So I think it is necessary, but it needs to be managed in the right way, and it can't just be a backdoor for transfers between the north and south, or the stronger countries and weaker countries. So it needs to be done correctly and done in a democratic way. And I think, although they have an architecture they're moving towards, it's not being done in a democratically accountable way enough yet. And it's not being done in a swift enough fashion yet to convince markets that this is really what they want.
Regardless of the reservations, a banking union is very much on the table amongst the bigwigs in Brussels, particularly with the expectation of a gradual recovery in the Eurozone in the second half of 2013.
The lessons of the crisis have been learned. EU heads of state and government have taken action and strengthened the governance framework. The current deepening of EMU is essential, in particular as regards banking union. It is of utmost importance that the legislation of the single supervision mechanism is finalized before the summer break, now that a political agreement has been found.
Proof that Draghi is more hopeful than others.
Long term, if the euro is to survive, then they have to accept, if you like, a full banking union. They have to accept mutualisation of debt. And I think theoretically they accept that at some time in the future, but Germany doesn't want to go down that route when it thinks that it might end up literally paying for it by the transfer of funds. But it's hard to see how we're ever going to get towards that through the convergence route. That means getting the economies matched up, because right now they're going in the opposite directions, that there's more difference between those economies in the south in particular, that spent a lot of time, if you like, getting up to speed and getting closer to what the economies of the north are like, and now that's just blown apart.
No one can predict the ending or whether it'll ever be happy, but one thing's for sure: the last 2 months have rocked the foundations of the very people at the heart of making those all-important decisions for the Eurozone's future.
In many ways, I don't feel any more confident about the euro than before, although there's been a period of calm. I think what's happened in Cyprus in particular, it's shaken me to the core, and I think that the euro is probably more under threat now than it ever has been before, even though the markets are still calmer.